My name is Christopher Tyler, and this is a brief overview of my new theory for the neural substrate of consciousness, that it resides in the deep interstitial pathways of the brain. Our understanding of consciousness remains rudimentary, both because it is hard to find specific brain structures that stop working when we lose consciousness, and because our experience of consciousness is so different from the activity of neurons recorded with microelectrodes. To try to capture our experience of consciousness, I turn to artistic depictions of it from various fields. It is clear that the consciousness in these depictions has a kind of electric luminosity and is somewhere in the brain, although it has a non-localized quality of not being associated with any particular structure, and even encompasses a dyadic aspect. This global, non-localized quality has given rise to an array of extraneural theories of consciousness being carried by physical energy beyond the neural spike code. But none of these account for the basic fact of consciousness shutting down when you go to sleep or reach the end of life. So I will be concentrating on neural theories. A major current theory of consciousness is the integrated information theory of Tononi, Koch and co-authors. They propose that what distinguishes conscious from non-conscious neural processing is the integrated information in the brain activity with what they call the maximally irreducible cause-effect power. There are a number of cogent objections that can be made against this tongue-twister of a concept, but the key one is that it is a purely informational concept without a meaningful threshold for consciousness. Somehow, when neural spiking activity that was not conscious rises above this threshold, it becomes conscious purely by virtue of its informational properties, which means it could apply to any complex system. To emphasize this point, here is a video of the magnetic arcs of the combustion activity at the surface of the Sun, indicating that it has much of the complexity of neural circuits and could therefore equally qualify for an informational criterion for consciousness. So a purely informational concept is insufficient to account for the consciousness of the brain per se. Many theories assume that consciousness is based somewhere in the cerebral cortex. To take an empirical look at the cortical involvement in conscious activity, I turn to a study of working memory, the classic kind of thinking task that requires a high state of consciousness to perform correctly, matching letters presented in a stream with the same letter presented 3 positions ago. This study first identified a set of 18 different subnetworks of cortical regions that operate together based on a brain scan with no task. The question was, which of these subnetworks were involved in the highly conscious task activity as measured by the functional connectivities between them? The answer is that the most strongly activated network was the one in the frontal lobe most associated with consciousness from previous work, shown by the thick red loop. The only other connections notably associated with this task were motor ones, as expected based on the use of a button press for the responses. The conclusion from this study is that very little of the cortex is actually involved in consciousness as probed by such a working memory task. We can ask a similar question about the electrical activity of the brain in different conscious states. Here are typical data for the spectral energy at left and global phase synchrony at right, a measure of the connectivity among the various brain regions. The different curves are for conscious dreaming sleep versus non-conscious deep sleep, with and without sleep deprivation. I have actually rescaled the phase synchrony data to show them relative to the full range of possible outcomes. Although there are minor differences, the big picture is that both measures are very similar between the conscious and non-conscious states, indicating that there is no drastic switch-off of either the electrical energy or the phase synchrony of the brain as a whole when consciousness switches off. The neural substrate has to be something much more subtle that is not revealed by these EEG measures. The interstitial theory of consciousness, on the other hand, proposes that the neural substrate for conscious experience, depicted here as an abstract resonant fractal structure, lies not in large-scale cortical activation, but in interconnections among the specialized core structures deep in the center of the brain. Thus, rather than the particular cortical regions identified here by Bernard Baars, it is proposed that consciousness as such lies in the brainstem, thalamus, and other subcortical connecting tissue, while the cortex is the information warehouse for the huge variety of the contents of consciousness, not its awareness of those contents. Otherwise, there is no good reason for preferring one region of cortex over another for this source awareness. The ascending reticular activating system of the brainstem has long been associated with the control of consciousness, the state of arousal, and its switch off for sleep and concussive loss of consciousness. The interstitial theory links this concept through the thalamus and the claustrum as the actual neural substrate of conscious experience. Here's a cross-section of the main thalamic nuclei, and these are the interlaminar and lateral nuclei that lie between and around them. These nuclei receive inputs from various interstitial brainstem networks, while the lateral reticular nucleus, or sheet, provides top-down selective inhibition for the control of attention. Each of these interstitial nuclei projects up to different sets of subcortical nuclei, cortical regions, and other brain structures. This deep brain network of connectivity forms the full interstitial pathway. Functional evidence that these interstitial pathways are the substrate of consciousness is found in studies of the reduction of signal flow with prolonged loss of consciousness, here in a case of COVID-induced encephalitis. The red to yellow coloration indicates the severity of disruption, starting with the base of the brain, progressing up through the brainstem regions, to the larger scale front-back connectivity, and up through the cerebral hemispheres. You notice that the changes in signal flow are occurring in these subcortical connecting pathways, suggesting that they are the ones carrying the signals most relevant to consciousness as such. In overview, these results are confirmed in a study of the brain structures impacted in the loss of consciousness due to concussion. The orange coloration shows that the effects are focused on the interstitial pathways running from the cortex down into the brainstem. This, then, is the essence of the interstitial theory, that consciousness is the nexus of activity in the deep brain pathways connecting the brainstem to the cortex, rather than the memory storage system of the cortex as such.